Welcome to the Roosevelt House and the CUNY Institute for Education Policy. I am Peter Meyer, Program Director of the Institute. In a moment, you will hear from David Steiner, Dean of the Hunter School of Education and former Commissioner of Education for New York State. As Commissioner, Dean Steiner played a leading role in securing the state's $700 million Race to the Top award, radically restructuring teacher preparation and accountability, and telling the truth about our state assessments. On returning to academia after his commissionership, the CUNY Board of Trustees voted to make Dean Steiner the creator and first director of this institute, which we formally inaugurated this May. We are New York City's first university-based policy analysis and research institute devoted solely to understanding the challenges of PK through 20 education. Strictly non-aligned, we aim to make it the go-to location for policy debate, analysis, and research. We are doubly fortunate to be building the Institute in this splendid building of great historical importance. A few years ago, Cy Flegel, a veteran New York City educator, told me about a conversation he had with Mayor Michael Bloomberg early in his first term, when the mayor was lobbying the state legislature to grant him control over the city's schools. Up to then, they had been run by 32 different community boards of education. "You want to be in charge of the schools?" Flegel asked Bloomberg. "Yes," said the mayor. "You're crazy," Flegel said. Unless they want to forego mayoral control of schools, the first education issue that the next mayor will confront is the Flegel corollary. Do you really want to run the nation's largest public school system? This morning, we welcome Anthony Weiner, a Democratic candidate for the top job. I'm sure he will address that question and others today, the second Next Mayor series. Bill de Blasio joined us last week, and next Tuesday, Sal Albanese will be here. Mr. Weiner is a former member of the United States House of Representatives and of the New York City Council. He grew up in Brooklyn, the son of a public school teacher, and attended New York City public schools. He began his political career in 1985 as an aide to the then U.S. Representative Chuck Schumer. With that, I want to get right to what promises to be a wonderful discussion about one of the most important topics in this year's mayoral race. Thank you again for coming, and I now turn the discussion over to David Steiner.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I thought it might be worth reminding us why we're here. We've invited all candidates who are on the ballot to answer some searching questions. At least I trust they'll be searching. Thank you. Searching questions about their educational platforms. Our institute is nonpartisan, and we will not be endorsing any candidate. It's the people of New York City who will choose the next mayor. As part of our mission, the CUNY Institute for Education Policy at Roosevelt House, we want to be sure that when making that choice, all of you have the opportunity to consider each candidate's position on the crucial questions of public education. Today's discussion will be on that topic. Let me turn to Anthony to say a few words about your educational views before we begin our question and answer.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you all for being here in this historic place. It is a welcome respite from the rhythm of the campaign, where often conversations get reduced to 30-second responses, 15-second lightning rounds. It's nice to have an opportunity to breathe deeply about a subject and to talk about one as important as this. Let me begin from a premise, and that is that we in New York City, as Democrats, we haven't won for 24 years now. And I think to some degree we haven't deserved to, because I think that we have built campaigns on an anachronistic foundation of what famous people have endorsed us, what organization, what labor union, what Democratic club, that no longer are we a population that looks out and says, all right, how does that person reflect my tribe, or how does that person reflect my labor union, that people are much more interested in the specific ideas that you have going forward. And I think that Democrats we're in the midst of this identity crisis about how campaigns are going to be run. So I've staked out this place where I believe, and I tried this in 2005, and I'm doing it again this year, where I'm saying, look, I'm going to try to do things differently. I'm going to try to build a campaign whose foundation, whose scaffolding is the ideas on how I would move forward. I think that allows a couple of things. One, it allows New Yorkers to kind of visualize your runway into the job, but it also gives you a certain level of independence to kind of call it the way you see them. If you're not trying to ingratiate yourself to a specific constituency, but if you're trying to really think through and unpack problems, I think you have the ability to say things and do things a little bit differently. So let me begin with some of my premise of this debate. First of all, I think we in New York City have this very shorthand, not very productive conversation about schools. We like arguing about charters, for example. The people that raise money in the charter school movement like having the fight. Editorial boards love having the fight. Even mayors like having the fight. Labor unions organize around the fight, but when we recall that it's only 5% of our students, and that for about 1 million kids and their parents, the conversation goes over their head, I think that one of the things that we have to do in this conversation is kind of turn down some of the rhetoric of the bumper sticker issues and realize that there are fairly broad, unifying themes about what parents really care about, and also where you should realize that for a lot of parents, the conversation about some of these issues, although they're enticing to in circles like this, well, it misses the point for a lot of parents. They're not going to a charter. They're not going to a charter school, so the conversation is doing nothing more than stirring a pot that they really are not going to get a chance to benefit from. And again, you can argue that you should or should not. Secondly, the notion of New York City governance of our public schools, mayoral control, is overstated. We have more control than we had, a lot more control, but all kinds of things we still have to go to Albany to get their sign-off on. You know, I talked about charter schools. There is this, I get a question all the time on questionnaires, do you want to increase the cap of charter schools? Well, no one ever asked the question, why is someone putting a cap and deciding what it is that New York City should do? I think it's in 2015 or shortly we're going to have to go back to Albany and have mayoral control reauthorized, and I'm sure the legislature is going to try to put another sunset in. So I think we still have more work to do in getting control of the public schools. Third, I think there is a lot more consensus among the public, among teachers, among the labor unions about the things we want to achieve, that if we're able to turn down the adversarial relationship between the mayor and teachers, it benefits all of us. I'll give you an example. You know, I have had the audacity to suggest in one of my idea books that I, as mayor, want the ability to pay teachers a little bit more for accepting tougher assignments. We have a weird dynamic that goes on because teachers, for a lot of reasons, want to stay where they're comfortable, want to go to the higher performing schools, want to go to the schools in the nicer neighborhoods, want to go to schools where their evaluations are going to look better. So there's a big disincentives for high quality teachers to go to the places actually we need them the most. I know that it sounds like I am going to break the china of the seniority system, but I think there have been instances where the city has negotiated with labor union, with the UFT, to figure out a way to reward teachers who go to tougher schools. Now, the experiment they worked out, which is basically rewarding whole schools for performance and things like that, I don't think was particularly successful. But I think if you ask individual teachers, would you support that type of an incentive to take tougher assignments, most of them would say yes, which means I think ultimately if you have an informed conversation with the labor unions, they would say yes, and I think to most citizens, viscerally, that seems like a reasonable thing to do. You can have that conversation, it is my view, without going into the thicket of having this giant adversarial fight over the contract that the teachers have. You've got to respect the idea that they are representing their members' views, but I think that there is a great deal of common ground. A fourth thing that I think that we need to have some level of consensus on is that the obsession with testing, both in the past formulation and in the Common Core formulation that we're going to read about tomorrow, the next day when the results come out, puts the emphasis in the wrong place. Not to say that evaluating students is problematic, but we are allowing, it's the high stakes part of the high stakes testing that is creating so much tension in classrooms with teachers and with administrators. You know, there's an enormous incentive, and you're going to see it in a couple of days when these results come out after the Common Core, after the first tests under the new Common Core framework come out. You're going to have people howling from the rooftops. That data is going to be proof point of whatever case people want to make. In fact, we've got to keep in mind that for the children who are in the schools, they're not reading the editorial pages of the New York Post. They're trying to figure out how they're just trying to learn, and their parents are trying to learn. We can't have it both ways. We can't every day thump our chest about saying, you know what, the school systems are failing, we're failing a generation of kids. And then when we try to do something seismic, when we try to do something to reorient this Titanic of a school system, that there aren't some problems, that it's not going to be easy. And I am not going to be joining my colleagues in beating up the mayor or beating up the school system or beating up the Common Core curriculum. What I am going to be doing is saying this. If we're going to do these things, we've got to have teachers not only bought in but well-trained. We've got to have teachers. They can't have 45-minute sessions every couple of months. We've got to have, I've proposed having a whole Common Core boot camp for teachers. I proposed training a whole collection of master teachers in the Common Core curriculum and what it involves. I propose having regular teacher training. Teachers, I think, are generally very responsive to the idea of learning best practices. This notion that teachers are kind of set in their ways, I want to do things the way they were always done, is not true. Teachers are constantly figuring out ways within the confines of their classroom to make things work. And let me conclude with this point. I would talk to my mother about her experiences in the classroom. She's a retired teacher. And she actually retired at the beginning of some of Mike Bloomberg's least productive reforms, when they were in this obsession about how a classroom was going to look and how the desks were going to be in a certain position and the walls were going to look a certain way. And I asked my mother, I said, well, isn't it important that you have these kind of consistent thematic things in classrooms so that you can compare one class to another, one teacher to another? And she reminded me something that the educators in the room probably realize, that when you're looking out over a class of 25 or 30 kids, that sometimes represents 25 or 30 distinct teaching challenges that often require you kind of understanding on the roll, as the semester is going along, which students you're going to have to handle in different ways. That's what makes teaching more of an art than I think the mayor and some people who talk about education think it's a science. And so if we honor that ethos, that it's that teachers are going to ultimately be the people who are painting on this tapestry most directly, and that if we give them the tools that they need and we have a conversation with them, survey after survey says that when parents say, who do they most hold accountable for the execution of education policy? It's not mayors, it's not superintendents, it's teachers. That's the case, and by the way, I think the public's right about that. In my administration, we're going to honor that. We're going to turn down the temperature of some of these generational fights. We're going to try to put the new curriculum in place in a way that we're competing not only against one school against another, but we're competing against Poughkeepsie, and we're competing against Pittsburgh, and we're competing against Peking. That's the imperative that we have.
Thank you. In the many, many heated debates about education reform, one is constantly repeated, and that is between those who feel that school reform, education policy reform can do wonders, and we clearly have schools that beat the odds and do extraordinarily well, and those who say, look, if you're really going to be serious about equalizing educational opportunity, you cannot do it without major reform of economic inequalities in this city. That when we have only 9% of African American males graduating high school capable of taking a community college course without remediation, we may make marginal changes in education reform, but fundamentally the economic disparity is like this juggernaut that undermines so many other possibilities. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, look, I have a 19-month-old at home. Raising a child at that age in the internet era can make you crazy. You can read just about everything on both sides of every argument, and you can read completely competing views about parenting ideas. It can be maddening. But there is one thematic thing. First of all, you realize, frankly, how non-research based a lot of the stuff about small children is, and how much of it's just based on tradition and folklore. But putting that aside, there is a consistent theme that has emerged now in the data as it exists. And that is the more net words a child hears in these very early years of his life is a determinant of how prepared he or she is to go into school. And unfortunately, that starting place is a pretty clear determinant of where they're going to be at each step of the way as far as college. With that as the foundation, my son Jordan has huge advantages over someone whose parents are both struggling, who are both out of the house doing maybe one, maybe two jobs. He doesn't, their children don't have the same daycare I'm able to have access to, not the same resources I'm able to put in front of Jordan. That's a fundamental thing that begins long before they even take a first step into a pre-K or a kindergarten class or a nursery school or anything. So first thing we need to internalize, and Sal Albanese, who you're having here next week, has talked about this continually on the campaign trail, is that we have to start thinking about education, not just through in the lens of the school building. So that means what? That means one of the ideas I put in my new idea book is we have to expand a maternity leave. We don't give any maternity leave to city employees. We say you can leave on disability if you decide to, but here we are, we're an employer of 300,000 some odd people. We don't give them any maternity leave, and I think that that's wrong. I think we're already taking the children of city employees and we're putting them in a place that we would hope that no employer puts their parents. Secondly, we have to take some of the economic pressure off. We have this blithe sense that, the city is doing so much better, we're creating all of these new jobs. It's true, we are. We're creating a lot of net new jobs. But they're very low wage, no benefit jobs in the food service industry, in the hotel, in the tourism industry. And the jobs that we're losing are middle wage jobs. And so what's happening? You're having more and more pressure on that wage earner, that middle class wage earner, to go compete for one, sometimes two of those low wage jobs. And who's getting displaced? A lot of younger families, a lot of young people who have returned from prison perhaps, a lot of people that don't have high school and college educations. We're compounding this bifurcating of our economy that's very troubling. So I don't believe we can have a conversation about education without dealing with that. But I also believe that it does give us a platform on which to talk about expanding the way we talk about schools. We can't just talk about schools with the moment they walk into the school building and the moment they leave. And if we're going to give them that kind of responsibility, we've got to expand the school day and the school year, and we have to give more resources within schools to deal with some of these economic challenges.
Okay. Let's talk about racial integration. Neighborhoods in New York City are actually becoming more integrated, but kindergartens are not. The average black kindergartner attended a school that had about 66% black students. The average white kindergartner attended a school that was about 52% white, even though whites made up only 16% of the whole population. We have lots of research that says poor kids do better in integrated schools. Is this an issue that you want to touch?
Yeah, look, all kids do better in integrated schools. I think that part of the reason that public schools, I think, have historically been this great ladder into the middle class and beyond, particularly in New York City, is it creates this great atmosphere of different types of people bouncing off each other like molecules in a microwave, and everything is, everyone winds up doing better. But frankly, that statistic you read is just another way of framing the statistic we talked about earlier, that there's enormous amount of social inequality and economic inequality in our system, in our city, and it manifests itself with one fundamental fact, that parents that have some level of economic mobility move their children to better educational opportunities, and you create a de facto ghettoization of everyone else. Now, there's two ways to deal with that, but the obvious way is, rather than browbeat those parents who are using their resources to get a better opportunity, is we need to figure out a way to elevate all of the schools in our city. Look, I'm going through this now. Like I said, I have a 19-month-old at home. My wife and I are contemplating what we're going to do next. My strong bias is to send them to public schools. I mean, I don't know what the public schools are like by Gracie Mansion. I'm going to have to find out. But I mean, But it should not be a circumstance where parents are looking at their neighborhood school and figuring out, I have to either flee this school somehow, or I am going to relegate my son or daughter to a second-class tier status. We've got to change that script. We have to, and this is a little bit what my concern is about the novelty of the charter schools, is it ignores the idea we have enormous amount of work to do in the traditional public school. We really have 3 school systems. We have one that has that kind of Gold Coast feel. The best teachers want to go there, the most active parents, they get the resources year by year. The second tier, that if you give them a little push, they can make it into that top tier. And then I'm going to say 60% of the schools that represent the rest, which have really daunting challenges. We have to create a dynamic where economic mobility doesn't mean people are trying to get out of those schools, and that means trying to come up with programs that incentivize middle-class, somewhat mobile parents to stay.
The platform you announced yesterday, in that text you talked about finally transforming our schools. This rather suggests that the current mayor may not have done so successfully. Can you name 1 or 2 major policy initiatives from the Bloomberg years that you actually disagree with?
That I actually disagree with? That's actually easier than the other way to form the question. Look, there has been in many ways that the school system has made it less accessible for parents. One of them is they basically created this core of people called parent coordinators that are paid by the Board of Ed to essentially manage the parents in the school. I believe that role, if it's going to exist, they should not be employees of the Department of Education, should be employees of the school system. We actually need something to amplify voices of parents. That, I think, structure services to try to try to hold them down and try to manage them in a way. They're essentially public relations because they work hard, I'm sure, and they're good people, but they're basically public relation figures for the schools. Secondly, it's indisputable at this point. Well, no, I guess some people dispute it, but it's indisputable in my view that the constant emphasis on testing and scores has created nothing but trouble. It created trouble that the mayor himself, I think, fudged the scores wildly leading up to his re-election in 2005. You know, I happen to know this because I was in that race, and a lot of those early numbers turned out to have been discredited. The obsession with numbers puts enormous pressure on teachers to teach to a test, which is a cliche now that is like uniformly recognized by parents because they see it. Basically teaching, if you want to chase a high-achieving student out of the school with parents that have some mobility, ask them about this focus on testing to the lowest common denominator. So that obsession has continued. And third, frankly, they've increased the city contribution to schools by about 100%. It's one of the only parts of the budget that's gone up dramatically over the past few years, putting aside things like debt and pensions and healthcare costs. It's hard to really point to the results that they've gotten because a lot of the things they did were very atmospheric. But I think the single biggest mistake that they made is they created this adversarial dynamic, not just with the teachers' union, which to some degree always, you always get a little bit of friction with employers and employee organizations, but teachers themselves. I think the morale among teachers is as low as I've seen it. People come up to me on the street and say, I'm a school teacher, I love my job, I'm trying to get out. And that dynamic has to change, and it will overnight when I become mayor because I fundamentally believe in what teachers do. I'm going to honor them. I'm going to have a conversation with them as adults, and I think that's going to be reflected in the better results.
Talking about honoring education reform, you have a number of proposals that probably would get the assent of many reformers, but they're expensive. And we could go through the laundry list, but for example, hiring business managers in 1,600 schools, a master teacher academy, building up community schools, all of these are big ticket items. Where's the money going to come from?
Some of them are big ticket items, some of them are not. For example, having an infrastructure, a core of kind of business manager types, controller types people to help out administrators so they can focus more on managing the educational imperatives of their school doesn't cost an enormous amount of money. We're not talking about one of them for every school. You don't necessarily need one of them for every school, but someone who can focus on the business aspects of running the school. Some of them may wind up costing a little more. Look, I think that everyone has their priorities. I have talked a great deal about lowering the cost of health care, for example, in our city by creating a single-payer health care system that takes a lot of the money that we pay for health care, saving a good portion of it by not outsourcing it to insurance companies, keeping the money here contained. I don't think that there has been a shortage of expenditure of money on schools. I frankly think that the money that we're spending, I think, can be spent a lot more wisely. But something else has to happen. You know, there was a time, you know, when my mother, again, not to use her as an example for everything I say about teaching, but, you know, we benefited from her in the school system for 31 years. She was a master's in finance. She represented the top percentage of her graduating class because, frankly, women of her generation, they could be secretaries, they could be nurses, or they could be teachers. So we were able to shop from the top 5% of women graduating colleges at the time. Well, if we're going to get back to that, we can't do that anymore. Now Goldman Sachs is shopping from the top 5%, and we keep having to slip further in. We may have to compensate teachers better, but not necessarily just in the form of cash. Giving them more of a career ladder, for example, giving them more of an opportunity to express their own outcomes, giving them more flexibility in the workplace. These are things that we have to examine. I'll tell you, not too many teachers coming into the school system today are interested in their pension in 20 years. A lot of them are saying, listen, I'm going to try to be a teacher here for a few years. I'm going to devote some energy to it. There are a lot of people who want to come into the school system who are experts in their field, but because they didn't have an education background, we have to change. And I know it might be heresy to some, but we have to change this notion of first thing you've got to be as an educator, and then we'll train you to do the other things. Well, nowadays, maybe we want people who are computer programmers, and we take a master teacher and train them on how to teach that. We have to change the way we look at these things, and not all of them cost more money.
Some of them do, including perhaps encouraging physics teachers and math teachers, where we have chronic shortages, particularly in the high school, of able top students. Are you willing to stand behind a shift that would support merit pay for teachers?
You know, I am prepared to say this, that I want the ability to be able to take the better teachers, the best teachers, and give them a little more money to take tougher assignments. I'm not going to call it merit pay. I'm going to say just that. That's the description of what I would like to do. But let me tell you this. If we think a little bit differently about how we shop for teachers, you know, right now, if you are a physics genius and you're emerging from MIT, you're probably not thinking about going into teaching. However, if you are someone that has been a physics genius for 15 years, you're at a point in your career that, you know, okay, I've launched rocket ships, I've created amazing products, but I want to now give a little something back to the community. I want to go into teaching. It ain't easy.
Should it be?
I think it should be.
I've met some physics geniuses. I've been privileged to meet some physics geniuses. If I was to say to them, you know, tomorrow morning, I'm going to take you to school in the North Bronx and put you in front of 30 16-year-olds, and you're going to teach them physics and math, most of them turn pale, I suspect. This isn't, I think, a job that you can do overnight. We have teaching fellow programs which have accelerated summer training and then put folks into the schools while they get their master's degree. Do you want to make it shorter, quicker, cheaper?
Yeah, this is where this conversation always goes off the rails. I'm not putting anyone in overnight in the South Bronx in a tough class. No, we're not doing that. But we are trying to shake up this conventional notion about how we create teachers. Look, everything about the schools are to some degree based on traditions that are somewhat anachronistic. And every day, and you know this because you did it so skillfully in the state level, every day we have to kind of shake free. We have a school schedule that is based on milking the cows in the morning and being back home in time so we can till the fields in the evening before the sun goes down. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, I bet you precious few of the 1.1 million kids in the school system are doing that agricultural schedule around which we base our school day. The point that I'm making is we have the same historic sense of the way we get teachers. We want people that are skilled in educating, skilled in the mastery of the education as an art, and then we help them get up to speed on everything else and keep up to speed on everything else. All I'm saying is that, just like so many other elements of the education script, we also have to recognize we have a lot of very talented people who it would be great to get into the classroom. So I think you can pair those two things without disrupting the system. Obviously, I wouldn't put anyone overnight out of the Bell Labs and put them, you know, in a school on Bell Boulevard. See what I did there?
You've obviously in some sense, past the charter school issue by saying it's impacting a relatively small number of our families. But there are 50,000 families on waiting lists, which suggests that they are hungry for something that the charter schools are offering. And while we may agree that it would be absolutely insane to take your eye off the other 95% of our schooling, I think you've avoided, frankly, some of the obvious questions. Would you go to Albany, and I agree it is an Albany issue, and argue to raise the cap, to have more charter schools? They are, after all, among the highest performing for some of our poorest kids on all of the research. So why the sort of bracketing off? Let's just talk about it.
Sure. I don't believe there should be a cap. If I want to create one, if I want to create 100, I don't believe there should be a cap.
Okay, great. And on one other thing, closing schools. As you know, it's been one of the most controversial issues. Those who champion it point to the performance of the small high schools that have been opened, and disclosure. We have been working at Hunter with New Visions for Public Schools in partnerships for residency training of teachers. Those who oppose it tend to say that it absolutely disrupts the community, the life of children and families, ends up sometimes in just warehousing those who are left. Where do you stand on what is, after all, one of the major platforms of the Bloomberg-Kleinism?
Right. Putting aside the success or failure of a smaller school, that's not why the chancellor and the mayor are doing it. The reason they're closing a school is because under the contract with the teachers, when they close the school, they can get rid of or move 50% of the teachers. It is simply a way to be able to use their tools to be able to do what they want to ultimately do, which is move teachers around. And I think that, frankly, it's not a particularly productive way to solve what is basically a labor, a contract negotiation thing. It disrupts enormous numbers of kids. You know, we forget this. You know, a lot of people think that when they close these schools, they're like, oh, that school's closed. No, it's still open. But the students who are in that school while it's being closed, what do we think happens to them? Do you think that they get shunted off somewhere else? No, they continue to go to a school that is gradually getting emptier and emptier and emptier and eventually empty. And then a fresh set of kids comes in after they leave. Think about the experience that student's having. Doesn't that student have a right to be in a vibrant public school in their own right? We're basically saying to those kids, don't worry, this school is a failure, but your sister who's not in the school yet, she's going to have a much better school later on. It is the worst possible, it's the worst kind of like rearranging of like atmospheric change. There is nothing stopping the administration from doing a lot of those things that they do in these so-called small schools. It's the same number of kids, sometimes it's actually more, the same number of kids in that school building, the same number of classrooms, usually the same number of teachers, usually more administrators, but the same number of teachers. If you believe you have some better way to manage that building and a better way to educate those kids, do it. Do it.
I think last point, some would dispute the idea that this is just a labor management strategy. Presumably, the administration thinks it's closing bad schools that have historically graduated fewer than 40% of their graduates in high school.
Right. So writ large, what are they doing? They're saying, okay, a building full of kids, we're going to take half the teachers out, put a different half in, create displacement for those teachers. You're going to have the same building, theoretically the same children. That disruption, and you're going to rebrand this floor and this floor and this floor. You're going to increase the amount of administration that's going to then go into this. And what are we forgetting in all of that? We're forgetting these children who I think if you believe you're doing something wrong educationally with those children and you're going to fix them in the new school, do it now. Do it with the kids that are in that school. How do you say to that child, you're part of a transition, young man. You're part of a transition. I know there are no kids coming in behind you because we're emptying the school. You know why we're emptying the school? Because this school is a failure. Okay, if you're that child, if you're that parent, I believe we're basically giving up on that kid, and that I don't want to do.
Thank you. So opening it up to the audience, and just a reminder that we will only take questions on education because that's what we're here to discuss. So, and there'll be mics coming around. just a second.
Oh, hi. Thanks. I have a very interesting question.
Could you stand up, because we'll
Oh,
hear you better?
sorry
Thank
about
you.
that. I have an interesting question. You've all hit a lot of rhetoric, but the basic thing is when you first start out at a school, you start with being tested, over-tested, where to go, etc. Then you get the division of school. Are you in Anderson? Are you in gifted and talented? Or are you in the general population? This division divides the teachers, divides the schools, and it makes parents crazy, certifiable. My kid is this, my kid is that. You're talking about children? We lose sight of the child.
So question is about streaming.
Yep.
Look,
Sorry.
I was in the public school system at a time when streaming was the state of the art. You know, 9-1, 9-2, 9-3, 9-4 were the different grades. I think I was in an SP program. I don't know what that stands for anymore. Yeah, it's funny that there's actually a return in educational discussions to maybe you return to that. I don't know what the answer is, except to say this. You do need to have the language of the conversation we have about schools has to have at least one of its channel has to be to talk to that middle class, somewhat aspirational, high achieving parent who has this, what they think is a smart kid, who wants to have a sense that the education is going to teach up to their level. We have to talk to those parents. That means I think you've got to have gifted and talented programs. I know this was a place that Joe Klein started out actually not feeling that you should. That it should be this egalitarian distribution of resources, that we have to treat all students the same, that we've gotten into this classism of the system. I do believe it's absolutely necessary if we're going to stem the tide of well-to-do parents sprinting from the system the minute they have an opportunity to. Now, I also believe that there are ways to combat the idea that the best teachers want to teach the best best kids. If you say, look, we're going to have a track of education, a track of teaching that is going to target like a laser beam the least well-performing children. We're going to really incentivize you. We're going to give you a career ladder that says it's actually a step up if you become a master teacher to focus on these tough schools, that we're going to give you a few, maybe an extra bucks to handle those schools. We're going to say to you, if you're in these schools, you're going to have these types of benefits and rewards. You're going to, whatever, I don't know what it would be. I don't believe that we have to be in either or. We can say that we still understand that there are higher and lower performing students, but I don't think it necessarily has to follow that the teachers, the best teachers and the best resources follow the best kids.
Okay. Question over here. There's a mic coming.
Thank you. Good morning. You touched on the fact of closing schools, underperforming schools. I'd like to know, as mayor, what would you plan to do to stem the tide against that? I've witnessed schools being closed in neighborhoods that need those schools. So what would you do to stop that for the underperforming schools?
Yeah, look, here's what I would do. I think that, first of all, we have some experience on if you take underperforming schools and you really put intense attention to them. You know, when I think it was under Rudy Crew, we had the Chancellor's District. That was this group of schools that were heavily supervised, that actually got some more resources. They brought in basically a SWAT team of good teachers and good administrators, and they tried to turn these schools around. I think that, you know, that the act of closing a school doesn't actually solve all that much. It gives us a nice feeling. I think, frankly, even the act of giving these short A, B's, and C's to schools, I don't think it's particularly informative to students. I think we should have a lot more transparency about our schools, a lot more transparency about how money is being spent, a lot more raw data about what's going on in those schools. But look, what I'm going to essentially say and do is that we're going to try to improve schools. I think to some degree, you know, this allure of closing and reopening schools, yeah, I think small schools are nice. I don't think that they're all that, with all due respect, I don't think that they're all that they're cracked up to be. I think that the real subdivision that I'm most concerned about is that teacher in that classroom. And that teacher in that classroom, making sure those students have the resources they need, they're in a safe place, they're well fed, that they have the kind of food carts on every floor that kids can grab their breakfast in the morning, grab fruit throughout the day, so we deal with child hunger in our schools better. I think making sure that teachers are well trained, that if you're in a low performing school does not mean you should have 50 pounds of textbooks from 1997, that you should have a Kindle in your backpack too. You know, I think there is a self-fulfilling element to the notion of we're going to close failing schools, because it gives this false notion of a fresh start. So people see it almost as, well, it's not so bad, we're going to get this fresh start, and we kind of lose sight of the fact that this is our school, this is our neighborhood school, we're committed to it, we're not walking away from it, we're not going to rebrand it, we're going to try to make it as good as possible.
Question. Over the last few years, most New Yorkers economically haven't had a pay increase just due to the economic times. Where are you on the issue of retroactive pay increases for union members, and what other changes would you want from the unions to do what you want to do going forward with the schools?
Well, this is a proof point of something I described at the beginning of this conversation about how I'm trying to do things differently. Here's the math. To give the teachers 1 year raises for 4%, just pick a number, would cost the city about $900 million. That 1 year, we will pay $1.3 billion in health care for those teachers. That's the math. That math is unsustainable. So what I have argued is that what I'm going to try to do is I am going to take the 15 some odd billion dollars we pay for health care, and it's for workers, for retirees, for the Health and Hospitals Corporation, Department of Health, the uninsured, and I'm going to try to get control of that in a single payer model that keeps the money here, doesn't give 20% of it to insurance companies, treats healthcare as not a cost but an opportunity cost, that if we don't stare at it, we actually do something, we can save a lot of money. I'm going to reduce the cost of healthcare, but I'm also going to ask city employees and retirees to pay a little bit. Ask city employees to pay 10%. They pay nothing now. Pay 10%, retirees to pay 10%, and if you smoke, you pay 25%. Basically to bring it not in line with the state, not in line with the private sector, but pay a little bit. And the reason is that one of the lessons that I learned in working on Obamacare in Washington is that it really is true. The data supports the idea that if you pay even a little bit, you're a much better consumer. You're a much better consumer. You demand on higher quality, you demand on lower cost, et cetera. So, and if I'm able to do that, I'm going to save a bunch of money. We're going to save a bunch of money because we're going to control cost, but we're also going to have a lot more money because workers are going to be paying in a little bit. That little bit adds up to a lot in the sense, and we're going to be able to give raises. We are in a situation now, the mayor has given no raises, had negotiated no contracts. Unlike my colleagues who are running, I'm glad he didn't. You know, he shouldn't have had a third term, so I just want him not to break anything during this term. So you know, the fact that he didn't do these contracts, while it's a strange argument, I want to be your mayor, but I don't want to deal with these personnel costs, it does, I'm glad I'm going to have that opportunity. It's expensive, it's challenging, but it also, like so many challenges, it gives you an opportunity. And I'm going to have a conversation with the teachers about the things we have in common. Now, I said this comes back to the point I made earlier. You know, I made that suggestion. But since I'm not going around shopping for every labor union support, they're basically quietly nodding their head. They understand. They're not happy that someone's saying it, but it's not the third rail that we've generally believed it to be in New York politics. It should have been done by Mayor Bloomberg. It should have been done by Mayor Dinkins. It should have been done by Mayor Giuliani. No one did it because everyone has run these races where they said, I got to stay away from these tough issues. Well, I'm doing things differently. I'm saying, let's talk about those tough issues because ultimately it's in our interest. And so now we're having that conversation, and it's going to give us the ability to give people raises, give them better health care, grow our health care economy in New York.
There was a question over here.
Going back to G&T for a minute, would you consider something where kids are identified from within the school system as pre-K, K kids who need support as gifted children? Right now, the gifted program is completely parent-centered. You have to request testing, you have to pursue testing, you have to then pick a school for your kid. Whereas we're not finding these kids, especially in the neighborhoods where, frankly, those kids could be a real inspiration if they're kept in the neighborhoods and have the supports they need.
Yeah, I agree with you. We're in a rich get richer dynamic, right? That people that have the bandwidth to be able to figure out the gifted and talent program, to be able to get their kids in a test prep thing, have an advantage. And arguably those parents already had advantages. They have that kind of time to be devoting to their children. They have that kind of resources to be able to buy test prep classes. I think that one of the great Rosetta Stones that we have to figure out is how we figure out a way to identify these achieving kids, how we figure out a way to create a farm system of kids that do it. One of the things that I think teacher training has to focus on better is identifying, having teachers identify better. You know, my mother would say that she had a code in her Delaney book that, you know what a Delaney book is, don't you? That the code in her Delaney book, sometimes I talk to new teachers and they're just like, they don't, what the heck? She had a code where she would put on each person's card, she would identify the kids that she had to make an extra effort to find assignments to be tossing their way while she's working on the rest of the class, because she identified. She said it's actually not hard to do. A good teacher knows those students. If we can figure out a way to get that into the institutional bloodstream so these children are then given that push to go do these things. And one of the things I think we've got to do is have places within each school, maybe we don't call them gifted and talented programs, but additional learning labs. Maybe they're at the after-school period, maybe they're just some structure within each school that we encourage children to go to, even if they don't have a distinct track. They're going into these extracurricular activities that foster it. And let me make one final point on that. You know, a lot of the conversation about co-location of schools comes down to this question of, is there space for a charter school? A lot of time there is space in these schools because people have abandoned the schools. Rather than simply thinking, and by the way, I'm not philosophically opposed to co-location. One of the things we were thinking is, as we're starting to lose students in these neighborhood schools and this space is emerging, is maybe we can use that space to come up to some kind of a magnet thing, like a music studio or a science lab or some additional resource that can go into that school that kind of draws back those high-performing kids and gives a place that the teachers can say, hey, you should go up to the science lab. You're a sharp kid.
Yep, over here.
Congressman, this morning's New York Times had an article on your former colleague Rahm Emanuel in Chicago. You may have seen it, and it was about the pension liability problem that is overwhelming Illinois, is overwhelming Chicago. Chicago is similar to New York in that a lot of the control of the pensions is at the state level. Philadelphia, they're paying current pension obligations out of their operating budget. This is a problem across the country. It's a problem that the mayor has not dealt with, the city council has not dealt with, Albany has not dealt with, and it's a freight train heading our way. Is it not true that despite all the creative and interesting ideas you have and the reforms you're promoting, it won't matter if you face the problem that Mayor Emanuel is facing in Chicago, where he's talking about cutting current pensions and fighting the unions, the cops, the firemen, the teachers. And this is a big issue, but if you just focus on education, how are you going to address the unfunded pension liability so that doesn't go off the rails with everything else you want to do?
That's a good question. Now, we in New York City don't have the same structural problem they have in Albany or in Chicago, because unlike their pension plans, our pension contributions and calculations are formed by an actuary. So they haven't been politicized throughout the year. Our actual pension liabilities are starting to drop now. They are due to have about an 8% increase over the next 4 years, but it's not anything like what they're anticipated to be in Chicago or in New York State. Now, I'm a member of New York State. I've lived here my entire life, so obviously the state obligations are troublesome. Look, one thing I'm not going to do is do it the way Mike Bloomberg's done it, which is basically heavily fund Republicans in the state Senate that then go off after the mayor's done negotiating contracts and put sweeteners in that wind up costing us an enormous amount. One of the things, I think that the mayor has just been not a very good player of the Albany game and understanding if you are going to throw around a bunch of money, let's try to get the outcomes that we want. On a very fundamental level, look, I think that actually, pension costs, as they've added more tiers, the out-year problem is starting to be, that people are focusing on a little more, but we do have a big structural problem in the out years. It's actually smaller than healthcare. The structural problem, the mayor on page 19 of his budget documents talks about non-controllable costs. First of all, I don't have the, non-controllable costs is not in my vocabulary. I'm always going to be looking for ways to figure out how you contain these costs. Healthcare is going up 40%, pensions are going up 8%, debt is going up 13%. Of the non-controllable costs, actually pensions have started to level off a little bit. We have a structural problem in the country that we have a death shortage. People are growing older, living longer lives, living more lives on pensions. There are things that we can do. I think that, frankly, having, for example, our uniform forces, which retired at a much younger age, having this overtime bump that triggers an increase in their pension, that's the formula that we use, that the state legislature imposed upon us. The formula for deciding how much we pay a retired cop is based on his last year, and if he had a bunch of overtime, that's why we're paying so much for those that retired after September 11th. But I do think that we're in a much better structural place than they are in the state, and frankly, New York State is in a better place than we are in a lot of other places. The one thing that we have not done in New York City is that because we have actuarial calculations about how much needs to be set aside for pensions, we haven't had the political games played with it that have been done elsewhere. It is a challenge, but I will say this, though. At least with pensions are going to middle-class New Yorkers that then have a livable wage that they can then put back in the economy. At least with debt, we're buying something by borrowing that money. We have a higher level of per capita debt than any time in New York City history. At least we bought something, a water tunnel, a bridge, a paved street. The problem with healthcare is that a large portion of the money that we're giving for healthcare isn't making us any healthier, isn't going anywhere of all that much value. It's just the same services are getting more and more expensive as health insurance companies have taken more and more of the vig, and as we've got less and less efficient on how we're spending healthcare dollars because we're sending people to emergency rooms and passing along the bill. I'm going to do what I can on pensions, which is try to negotiate contracts that make sense for my citizens when I'm mayor, and do everything I can to have Albany to butt out when I'm done with that process, so that labor unions don't go up to Albany and get a state senator from Schenectady adding to their benefits.
Fittingly, our guest is now shortly due at a discussion of these issues with the other mayoral candidates that Hunter College is also a part of organizing. So you're moving from a debate and discussion of education to one of this major proportions. I just want to say thank you for joining us for what I hope people have felt is a substantial conversation about a very serious set of issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you.